I'd like to just kick off by introducing Philip Ashmole, who's been the main man, or one of the guiding lights at very least, for all the project's life for the last 22 plus years. And he's going to introduce the colleagues in Borders Forest Trust and explain more about how we'll go about the day.
Well, I was trying to remember when it was first that I talked to the NWDG. I think it was probably 1998. It was certainly a very long time ago, before we actually owned Carrifran. And Adrian Newton and I came up to one of the early meetings. So we do go back now nearly a quarter of a century. And it's worth remembering that, because Carrifran, I think, was a genuine pioneer, because we were talking about what we would now call, of course, rewilding a long time ago. It goes back actually before Borders Forest Trust existed, when Fee and my wife Myrtle and a couple of other people, and Goodburn in particular, began thinking seriously about the lack of native woodland in the Scottish borders. We're not quite in the borders here, we're just adjacent to it in eastern Dumfriesshire, but we were focusing on the borders at that time. And in 1993 we ran a conference, a landmark conference I think, called Restoring Borders Woodland, which was before BFT, a couple of years before BFT, it was 3 years before BFT existed in 1996, and we were just focusing on the fact that the borders had less native woodland than probably any other county in Britain. I haven't checked about Cape Ness, but I mean in percentage terms, but ancient woodland, ancient and semi-natural and semi-ancient woodland, less than 0.05% of the land area in the borders. That's Chris Badenoch's figure. He was the Nature Conservancy man on site for many years, and a key in supporting us in the early days. So it was that attempt to focus the attention of people who mattered, people who had the reins, in a sense, who were the landowners and farmers. We tried to get them to come along to a meeting, and we started by inviting the Duke of Buccleuch. He didn't come, but his son did, who was then chair of the Millennium Commission, one of the original lottery, certainly a member of the Millennium Commission, one of the original lottery good causes, and the Millennium Forest for Scotland Trust, MFST, which most of you will still remember, but when I get student groups up now, they've never heard of it. But it was a key to the start of restoration of native woodland in Scotland. What we have become aware of was that there were lots of people focusing on Caledonian pinewoods, and nobody was still talking about the southern uplands. And yet we were much more denuded in percentage terms than the highlands. And the shadows, I can't move this very far, I want to stay outside of the wind. This is Carrifran with the green around it here. And I wanted everybody to see this map, and you obviously can come and look at it closer, but I'll have to take it down before we go because it'll get wet. It's to put in context what we're doing in the southern uplands. This black polygon here is one of the wildland areas, not designated but identified by SNH, as was in a 2013, I think it was, operation largely done from Leeds University Wildland Research Institute. The criteria across Scotland were pretty obvious. The lack of buildings, remoteness, lack of roads, lack of big plantations, that sort of thing. Not primarily ecological ones. So these were wild, very much in quote marks, because none of them are probably anything like natural. The Highlands is full of them, of course. There are lots of wildland areas, and you can go online and see the map that they produce. But the southern uplands really only had 3 identified in that original survey. One is around the Merrick, the highest point in the south of Scotland. One was round Broad Law, which is almost as high as the Merrick, 840, up here, and one which they now call Fell wildland area, around Whitecombe and adjacent stuff here. In the revision of the map, a couple of years later, they eliminated the Broad Law one, for reasons that I haven't investigated. It does have a building on the top, which is one possible reason. That leaves only the Merrick and this one, Callahat Fell. Now that's its boundary, set by S&H. It's fairly obvious it goes between peaks. It's pretty straightforward. And you will see that Borders Forest Trust, which now owns 3 sites within this area, was opportunistic, by foresight I suppose, already the owner of a significant fraction of that wildland area, because we of course have been looking for wild areas suitable for ecological restoration. We bought this on Millennium Day, so this was one of the very first attempts to bring back native woodland in Britain. There were very few ahead. And the egg buyout was just gone through, and there were a few other things, but this is why so many people are coming to Carrifran now, because we were rather ahead of the pack. Because we bought it on Millennium Day, but we had a 2-year lead time, because we got an option on the site of 2 years from the farmer, a legally binding option on him, but we could walk away if we failed to get to our target price. The price was agreed. This was primarily to give us the opportunity to fundraise. The fundraising was done entirely by amateurs, with only a girl in the original BFT office, one lady who was set up to send receipts for donations, and BFT was then had been set up as a formal entity and as a Scottish charity. So we were able to get gift aid credit on. So the rest was completely unprofessional, and I think that was why it worked actually, because we were very good at brainstorming. And the main decision, and I think it is important, I know it's not ecological, but it's important, was that we realised that we had a third of a million, well say 400,000 by the time we got this little extra bit at the bottom. We needed to get that in 2 years. We knew we couldn't do it with jumble sales and posters on collectors on the streets and so on, although we did those. But we asked people for serious money. We asked them for 500 or 250 quid to become founders of Carrifran Wildwood. Key other funding aspect, while I'm on it, we have a wonderful benefactor in the form of the founder of the Edinburgh woolen mill, David Stevenson, who sold it off about 30 years ago now, and set up a big trust. And he came and made a commitment just about the time we finally bought the site, to pay for the propagation of all the trees planted at Carrifran. I budgeted that with him at 150 grand for 500,000 trees. We're now up to 700,000 trees, and he's still paying us about 180,000. And he's proud, I think, of the fact that he can say he's paid for all these trees. So clearly we are eyeing up, we call these 3 sites our wild heart sites, and we collectively refer to them as the wild heart of southern Scotland, and you can imagine that we are sort of eyeing up the missing bits, but they are, this one for example is in the hands of Wynns and March estate, and we're not likely to get our hands on it easily, but this one belongs to Scottish Water, which should be much more of a possibility. And this is still privately owned by the man who sold us Carrifran, so possibilities there. So clearly it would be nice to have a more coherent core, ecological core. Now the management within BFT of the 3 sites does differ, because when we set up Carrifran, we set it up with very specific aims. This was an amateur group, remember, thinking before BFT even existed, and we were not necessarily scientists. There were some scientists, but also lots of other different kinds of people. And we thought it through, and we came up with this that I'd really like you to read. Well, actually, I think it's worth reading it now. It's very short. Carrifran Wildwood mission statement, which was actually composed almost entirely before we had a site in mind. And this is a key distinction between Carrifran and a conservation site, because the conservation sites are designated or formed because they are already special. This was devastated. There was nothing, hardly anything natural left in it. So it was a restoration site. So that's a key aspect of it. The Wildwood project aims to recreate in the southern uplands of Scotland an extensive tract of mainly forested wilderness, with most of the rich diversity of native species present in the area before human activities became dominant. The woodland will not be exploited commercially, and the impact of humans will be carefully managed. Access will be open to all, and it is hoped that the wildwood will be used throughout the next millennium as an inspiration and an educational resource. Now, I wouldn't change, that was proposed in about 1996. I wouldn't change a word of it now. But the point is, and I'm stopping just about now, that this puts nature first. It's not a people-oriented thing. The impact of humans will be carefully managed. We do it as subtly as we can, but it is management. And of course access is free to anyone. But it's a primacy of nature in the way that NNRs used to be. That was their strapline, primacy of nature. They've eliminated that now. It's now nature and people, or people and nature. So this is not primarily for people, but look at you here. And that's the bottom line of that mission statement. We did realise that it could be an inspiration, and it's worked out much that way. Have I missed out anything critical, please?
I don't think so, Philip. No, I think that's great. But this is a key tool in the management of people, a very small car park.
And it was John Muirtrust, a guy who pointed that out as a good idea. And so we designed it and we made it invisible from the road and gated. Critical. Yes, it's not like the Grey Man's Tail up the road, which is a wonderful magnet, honeypot, taking the pressure off Carrifran. But of course, here we do cater for people by having a circular trail, which is only a half-hour walk, where there's some signage, and it aims to introduce people to what's going on. But it also aims to divert the pressure from the upper part of the valley. You want to mention the tree of the year?
Oh, yes, okay. I think that's brought a lot more people here. Yes, that was the Woodland Trust. We'd used this tree on our brochure, the second fundraising brochure, I think. And where one tree survives, a million will grow. Well, we've seen it happen. So the tree is pretty insignificant, really, and it was sitting the only really visible tree on the hillside. There were some in the deep klooks, you know. But the story that this, now that it's protected by not being grazed, has got all these progeny, which you will see, really appealed to people, and that's why we won. The wonderful thing about that was that we got put into the next round, and in the end 30,000 people looked at the BFT website. That's got to be useful, hasn't it?
I'm just curious, you know me, Donald. I'm just curious as to what the community feel about the proposal, and particularly the community that's associated with the with the culture of the area.
Yes, and it has been a difficult one. It's been a difficult one particularly because of the feral goats. As ecologists, you all know that feral goats and young trees don't go well together. And it really hit us very hard, didn't it, Fee? It was tough. And it hit us just about the time when you were organising the first school visit from Moffat, which is the closest town. This issue burst on us because we had to remove them. We removed them alive, in spite of what some people say. All but three. We couldn't catch the last three, so we did shoot them. But we took over and we found homes for them, mainly through the British Wild Goat Society. Our wonderful project officer, Hugh Chalmers, project officer, later BFD trustee, who managed the early years here. He also managed the goat removal, and he and I drove them the length of England, depositing them in various places, including Windsor Great Park. But that's another story. Yes.
Ongoing. Shall I talk? I think that was the initial hiccup, and we found out it was a very small minority, and the baseline was partly goat loving and partly an unwillingness to accept change, and there were definitely a few individuals who didn't want the valley to change in its appearance, and this is human nature, unfortunately. But what I perceive now is that they're seeing it change, and they realise that it's exciting and interesting, and the people who walked their dogs there in the past are still doing so, and we meet them and they're mostly appreciative. There have been the odd bits of hostility, but they're quite diluted really by the goodwill. So I think that it was worth persevering, sticking to our guns and getting this thing done to show people what could happen and how rapidly the environment could change. It's been so thrilling to be looking at it over 22 years and just seeing it develop year on year. It's been wonderful.
I'm Adrian Kershaw, I'm Engagement Officer for Borders Forest Trust. I work primarily with our volunteers. We have about 400 volunteers registered with us. We run weekend camps. We have core teams coming to each of our sites one day every week. And the volunteers provide a backbone to the organisation. Of the 2 million plus trees we've planted, 10% of those have been planted by volunteers, so 200,000 trees, sometimes in really inaccessible areas. So we have people who are willing to give their time freely and undertake all sorts of different tasks. Volunteers come from all different sorts of backgrounds. We have people who are retired and have some time on their hands. We have young people looking to get into conservation work, environmental work, and we have some groups that just want to give something back to the local community and may do some other type of volunteering, but decide one day every couple of months they're going to come work with us. So we're always looking for more volunteers. We welcome people to our sites, enjoy seeing new faces, and we're a friendly group, so if anyone wants to volunteer with us, please get in touch.
Have any of you heard of the rotten bottom bow? Yes. Yes, most of you know more about it. Perhaps David noticed of. But we do have a pollen record as a result of that bow being found there on our land, but before we were involved. As a result of that, Richard Tipping, who's probably been a frequent member of this group, I imagine, did what he reckoned was about the best upland pollen record in Britain, because it went back over 9,000 years and very much to the end of the last ice age, right through to the present. And the bow is about 6,000 years. That's a little bit older than the Iceman in the Alps, it was presumably right at the end of the hunter-gatherer culture in this area, because it must have been transitioned to the Neolithic just about that time locally.
What was it made from, Philip?
Yes.
What was the bow made from?
The bow was made from yew, which we don't really accept as a native species here, but it's only just 30 miles away as the crow flies in Teesdale, that sort of area on calcareous rock. So we have planted a token number, about 10 yews of Cumbrian origin, which are doing extremely well, which will point well out in Holly Gill. So yes, they are a token, but I think there was only one pollen grain recognised in the analysis. But of course, that means that there might have been quite a lot in the whole sequence, because you're only investigating a few horizons within that long. And they had got 3.2 metres of beat vertically. They found the deepest place in that bog, so it is a very special site. The only convenient publication of it is in our first book. I managed to persuade Richard to produce the data, and Myrtle drew the diagram because he'd never published it properly himself.
And was it all volunteers, or did you have contractors?
Yeah, the grant-aided planting was done by contractors, and that again was a strategic decision. We were planting about 50,000 trees a year, and we realised we just couldn't do it with volunteers. So we had Hugh Chalmers as site officer, and he managed that planting for those 8 years, and then moved on to another job. But he did a wonderful job, and in spite of the problems with foot and mouth and various other things, it basically got planted. We had, yes, there was a technical issue, which was interesting. These things are normally inspected after 5 years, and then you're told you can have the last tranche of your grant. With the first grant, we had a rather generous woodland officer who passed them without any problem, really. We then got somebody who was a little bit tougher, quite reasonably, who said, look, these trees really aren't what we consider established in a waist height and clearly going to survive. Can we give you another 2 years to get them up to that height and that condition? And we were perfectly happy with that. And he came back after another 2 years, so after 7 years, because our growth rates are slow, obviously high up particularly. And we were naive in some respects. And the main respect in which we were naive, which we were going to talk about later, but perhaps it's better from here. You can see that bracken is important. We rather underestimated the bracken, I think, because it probably had been subject to a lot of trampling. There were cattle as well as goats and sheep, and so it didn't seem such a bad problem as it turned out to be. What we found, as probably all of you know very well, that although it's lovely to use bracken patches as places to plant oaks, the oaks love it, but they do have to get away first. And when the bracken dies in the autumn, it flops, and if you've got a small sapling, it just gets not necessarily shaded out, but just completely swamped. And so we went back, and having used only voguards in all the original planting, 20 or 30 centimetres long, and now a major problem to remove in terms of plastic particles, which we are trying to face up to. But if we only use those and a small spot spray of glyphosate pre-planting, which was basically insisted on by the Forestry Commission at that time. BFT has now abandoned all protection for planting trees. It's done entirely with screeping. Fingers crossed, but that's not this site. And so yes, and all use of glyphosate. But we finished that systematic planting, grant aided, done by contractors, usually small groups of contractors, individuals, pairs of people who came back year after year, whom we got to know. And basically Hugh would go out and say, look, there's a strip down the hillside in this compartment. I want 10,000 trees in it by April, and I'll pay you 70 pence a tree or whatever. And that worked pretty well.
Philip, how did you go about matching the species to site? Because it's
Yes.
impressive to see such a good job of that being done.
Yes, we had NVC and ESC, Ecological Site Classification analysis of the whole site. And Adrian Newton, who was a professional forest ecologist at Edinburgh University, did the main planning, and we then went to SNH and said, look, when we were partway through that planning, we went to SNH and said, look, we're just about to purchase, this was all done before we had bought it, we're just about to purchase a large chunk of your Moffat Hills SSSI and now SAC, and we want to change its entire ecology. And we got away with it, I think, because Adrian was a respected professional forest ecologist, and we had obviously done our homework. We'd run a couple of high-profile conferences aimed specifically at raising our credibility, and so they could see we were talking sense. But specifically, it was NVC, ESC driven on the ground. But it all comes out. I mean, the greens really are all, the dark greens anyway, are upland oak birch woodland of what is it, W11 and W17, is it? I always forget. And down the bottom some mixed broadleaves just along here. And then we've got something that does come out as juniper woodland up there, around the corner there, which has been more or less successful. Up there, there's a bit of, on the pale bit, just below the conifers, there's some W4 birch woodland. But that's basically what it is, a rather simple picture, as I think you'd expect, wouldn't you, Gordon?
Yeah, but the other part of it, which I think is impressive, is actually doing the work. You mentioned the contractors became well used to it, but what often seems to let down native woodland schemes is the difficulty or refusal, or whatever the right word is, to try and match more intimately. So it's big batches of one species, big batches of another. So you haven't done that. So how did you get them to do it right?
Yes, we did our best. One of the things we did rather well, I think, was to force them to use more or less random planting. There's a very strong instinct in all of us to over-disperse planting, to get even spacing. We did not work to our REF, but rather too common here. Yes, we did not ask them to space the trees at 2.5 meters. One time I even tried to persuade them always to plant every fifth tree within 50 centimeters of another one, because in a natural woodland that is the way that trees grow. They often, as you know, they grow tight up against each other. They like being with each other, often of different species. So, but matching to the substrate is obviously something that individual contractors and planters get to know, and our volunteers are quite good at it. But we've had very interesting discussions with the Forestry Commission about the patchy nature, particularly of this slope. William McGee got out the conservator at one time when he was getting worried about it. And we sat on the slopes up here and looked across there, and they were very unhappy. But it does reflect the nature of the substrate, and that of course is a key aspect of ecological restoration. Whereas the foresters are trying to obliterate the fine-grained diversity of the substrate by ditching and other ground prep. We did no ground preparation, but you do see what happened, and therefore you see what the ground is good for. And sort of it is, and I would perhaps make a slight exception. There's more bracken than there should be, and it will gradually get colonised by trees. But there is at the moment probably too few trees in the brackeny patches. But most of the rest, where you get the flushes coming down and so on, they're either too wet or too rocky or both for trees to flourish. So although some trees have probably been planted in them, they quickly tell you whether they want to be there or not. So our mortality figures are probably quite high. As I say, we never had real trouble with keeping the numbers up, but that allowed for 20% And we planted at 1,600 stems per hectare, and we're required to have 1,100 after 10 years. And so we never had difficulty in getting to the getting above the 1,100, but that's quite a big margin. So mortality did help us to show our way, I think. We've just put up this panel. Some of you had a chance to look at it already, probably. These data are in the new book too, but it just shows that as you create a new native woodland, native woodland birds come in. Nothing surprising there, but oddly enough, nobody else has demonstrated about it worldwide. Apparently there's no example over 2 decades of starting from scratch and watching birds coming in as you create the woodland. And there was a lag. This is the baseline for the main graph, which is the addition of the different species indicated by year here. It was about 7 or 8 years before very much happened, as you might expect. And then it's going up pretty steeply.
Talking about returning species, where are the nearest wild boar, pine martins, red squirrels?
All of them within 5 kilometres. So yes, they're on the way. We haven't actually. We've got one scat currently supposed to be getting a proper DNA analysis, a genome analysis, but I haven't had a result on that
pine
yet.
martin.
Well, yes, there might be pine martin, or might be actually the guy who looked at it and is I hope sending it to the appropriate people. Said, what about polecat? It looks a bit like a polecat scat, which would be even more surprising. You know, pine marten wouldn't be surprising. They're just up the road, and red squirrels are down that way. We've had 2 or 3 sightings over the years of red squirrels here. After a good hazel crop a few years ago, we had a couple of sightings. And no greys so far, but we've got monitoring going on, so we shall have to bite the bullet on that one when we get greys, because they're just down the road too.
Looking back, Philip, what would you have done differently?
I sometimes say to people that I think that when we wrote that mission statement and compare and then if we saw it now, I said we wouldn't change a word of that, but I think actually it's become ridiculously similar to what we had in mind. I mean, people do come here now and say, look, I can hardly believe that this isn't natural woodland. I mean, it clearly isn't, obviously, because it's not too young. But we do actually get people saying, was this really planted? And that's exactly what we wanted. So, not much different.
No, majority.
I wonder what state they're in now. See what happens.
Because I do think a lot of
This little watercourse here, and this willow is also natural regen. So yes, Stuart is worried. Well, now it's sad that we haven't had more rapid natural regen, particularly at birch. I mean, it's obviously, it's very well known that birch doesn't regenerate in a thick sward, and the absence of cattle from this site or anything analogous to a really heavy hoofed herbivore is a real issue, I think, because and this shows us the kind of places where it can somewhere that's moist and not too competitive. High up, it's very difficult to see how that's going to happen. So yes, it's a real issue, and one of the issues that our steering group was discussing on Tuesday at Fee's house, whether we really needed to move ahead and getting back big herbivores on site.
Is that like wild boar or bringing some cattle for a spell?
We put conservation prison again. About 3 years ago, Hugh Chalmers wrote a proposal to SNH for bringing back half a dozen pigs for 3 weeks in a trial to see whether you could detect any regeneration as a result. I think it was absolutely minimal, but he had a local farmer who was prepared to do it, had the pigs, was prepared there to take responsibility for them. We were going to voluntarily, keep an eye on them. We sent it to SNH, and they came up with an incredible list of PDOs, potentially damaging operations. That one of their relevant officer had been out on site, read all the fine print of the designation, and came up with a host of reasons why we couldn't do this. I mean, it was clearly completely over the top, a response. But it basically killed the idea for the moment. It's very depressing when you come across it. But it wouldn't. I wasn't terribly impressed by the idea in the first place because it was so minimal. But at least it meant that it should have got through without difficulty. So yes, it's a real issue.
Well, what a fantastic day. Here we are at Carrifran, and a fantastic debt of gratitude to Borders Forest Trust for hosting the visit here today by the Native Woodland Discussion Group, and it's just proved to be such a great example of what the Native Woodland Discussion Group is about. All sorts of people here. There's people interested in the paleo environment, flora, fauna, woodlands, history, culture, community, you name it. The Native Woodland Group is just a brilliant place to informally chat about all the things that are going on in sites like this around Scotland. We get into some really interesting corners and speak to some really interesting people like the guys here at Borders Forest Trust. It's a very reasonable organisation to join. Annual membership is £20 or less. For that you get 2 newsletters a year. We organise trips like this. We've got a programme of one-day events going on this year. The Native Woodland Group Discussion Group have got a good website. You'll find lots of useful information on there, including how to join. It's on Facebook, it's on Twitter too, so we're on most of the social media platforms, and we will include details of these visits, including the one here at Carrifran, hosted by Borders Forest Trust. And the different thing about this is that it is now 22 years old, so we've got an example here which is different to virtually everywhere else in Scotland. We've got 22 years of evidence that native woodland re-establishment is possible and is actually thriving. In another 20 years this place will have rewilded, but to call it rewilding 20 years ago, the term hadn't even been thought of. So, a fantastic, significant, substantial example of how things have been artificially created but look natural and are becoming natural as time goes by. Being colonised by lots of woodland plants and animals, birds in particular now, which just wouldn't have been here 20 years ago. So, the proof of the pudding is where I'm standing.